bacteria and yeast that are present and what they're doing and how they even are a part of our systems to sustain life. It's incredible. And it's quite complex. And even when we talk about it in coffee, we like to oftentimes talk about it as very simple and very linear. And it's just not that. It's not that kind of a system. Now, you do some of that thinking comes from an industry like the wine or the beer industry, where they work so hard to make sure that it is a very linear and singular type of process. Now, putting aside kind of the natural wine movement and some of that kind of stuff, but you do have, I mean, their goal is to create an environment that they can control, and they're controlling so many facets of that in order to get specific outcomes. And I know we talk a lot in coffee about wine and beer and other things. And while I do think some of those analogies are appropriate, the vast majority of them are not, because fundamentally they're different products. They're different in terms of their production and their post-harvest processing, but also in their consumption and in the supply chain. So I want to clarify that I will make some references to that, but I do at a very fundamental level believe that they are very different. And so we can kind of take what we want from them and kind of learn, but also do that with a certain degree of caution. So as we continue to talk about metabolism, there's two basic types of metabolism that we want to focus on. And really all of the different metabolic pathways can be contained or described within these two processes, both anabolism and catabolism. So anabolism kind of comes from the Greek prefix being to build up or up, and catabolism being Greek for down. So anabolism being the building of compounds, and catabolism being the breaking down of compounds. And you are processing different parts. Yes, I'm assuming that was the reference to the wine industry. Absolutely, 100%. So the anabolic pathways being those that build compounds, but they require energy. Okay, and remember we kind of mentioned that ATP. That's where that becomes so important. Those anabolic pathways are all about building compounds, but yet they require some sort of energy. Now, again, it's not always ATP. There's lots of other types of energy, but that's one thing that you will find as being utilized in its different variations. You'll hear me talk about ATP as well as ADP. So ADP being adenosine diphosphate, meaning two phosphate groups, whereas ATP is adenosine triphosphate, which is three different phosphate groups. So just as kind of thinking about that or keeping that in the back of your mind as we continue these conversations. Catabolic pathways, in opposite to anabolic, are breaking down of compounds. And when there's that breaking down, there is a release of energy. There's energy that is produced in that. And here in a minute, I'm going to talk about two of the very common especially to coffee and to botany, two of those anabolic or two of those metabolisms, one anabolic and one catabolic, that work hand in hand in sustaining life and creating energy for a coffee plant and even a coffee seed. But when that ATP is broken down, when that energy is utilized, that's a catabolic process, and it becomes ADP. There's other byproducts of that as well. But the thing that we realize, I showed you this picture here of kind of this circular metabolic pathway. These anabolic and catabolic pathways often happen in that respect, where something is being broken down, which is creating energy. Something is then being built back up so that it can be broken back down, and that cycle continues. Interestingly, with our human bodies, because we also are participating in these anabolic and catabolic pathways in the thousands, happening constantly. One of the things that really monitors or controls that are hormones, which is an interesting, when you start talking about hormone imbalance or hormones within our body, those hormones are what help regulate those different anabolic and catabolic pathways. So Let's talk about some of those. Photosynthesis and cellular respiration. Okay, photosynthesis is an example of an anabolic pathway. Okay, and you can see that represented here in this diagram. Okay, so photosynthesis being an anabolic pathway where plants are harnessing energy from the sun to generate sugar and oxygen. Okay, so they're going to harness, and I have a graph here, a diagram here in a minute. I'll show you where we break this down. But we understand that photosynthesis is an anabolic pathway, and cellular respiration is a catabolic pathway. Okay, so photosynthesis, anabolic pathway, building compounds, cellular respiration, catabolic pathway, breaking down those compounds, breaking down sugars in order to get energy. Here is a kind of a breakdown of the kind of those pathways at a chemical structure level. So you can see up at the top cellular respiration. I should have flipped those because I had anabolic and then anyways. So you see here at the top cellular respiration where we have glucose and oxygen that are being utilized. That glucose is being broken down and we're creating energy through that process, ATP. Now, I do want to note here with this cellular respiration that there are many ways that this can happen, and they have different degrees of efficiency. Okay, so this specific chemical compound here, or this chemical formula rather, is what we would call aerobic cellular respiration because there's oxygen present. Okay. Oh, there's an issue with the sounds. Did you guys lose me? Are we still good? Okay, still good. Alex, is it volume or is it just okay, cool. Everybody's saying good. Apologies for that, Alex. Hopefully you get it sorted. Let me know if you are still having any issues. So cellular respiration here being utilizing oxygen in the process with what we would call aerobic cellular respiration. And in terms of cellular respiration, it is one of the most, if not the most efficient cellular respiration. It creates a significant amount of energy in that process. Photosynthesis at the bottom there, you see that there is light, which is your energy source. So you're absorbing that energy, utilizing carbon dioxide and water to build up glucose and oxygen. Okay, so again, there's lots of other metabolic pathways we could discuss. Obviously, with coffee and plants and so forth, we talked about these two, photosynthesis and cellular respiration, because they're essential to sustaining life. But you can see an example here of photosynthesis, an anabolic pathway, and cellular respiration, a catabolic pathway. There's a couple other key compounds that are utilized. I just want to give those to you here. So basically, when we look at different types of, I know the PowerPoint screen went away. I'll bring it back here in a second. But when we look at different compounds that are utilized in the process, we're going to be identifying that some of the key compounds that are going to be built up or that are going to be either absorbed through food or going to be stored are going to be your proteins. Oops, I have to turn on my pen. Okay, proteins, fats, and carbs, if you allow me to write it shorthand, carbohydrates more particularly. And the fourth kind are going to be nucleic acids, which we're not going to talk an extreme amount about those, but I just want to list those so that you're aware. And when you have these compounds present, these are larger compounds, they are broken down. Proteins are broken down into amino acids. Fats are broken down into fatty acids. And carbs are broken down into glucose. Now, nucleic acids, just if you're curious, they're broken down into nucleotides. But again, that's not something we'll talk. Nucleic acids being more of your RNA and DNA. But the reason why I mention this is because as we begin to dive into talking about different types of compounds in coffee, when we talk about the presence of proteins, we talk about the presence of fats, triglycerides, or carbs, those types of compounds are going to be broken down through various different processes into these base components. When they are broken down, and remember that breaking down does require energy, so they're going to be broken down and they're going to be broken down and produce energy. apologies, I said that incorrectly. Those compounds are going to be broken down, and that breaking down of those is going to create energy and have byproducts, whereas the building up of those are going to require some type of energy as well. And so just kind of keep that in the back of your mind. And you can see already where we've mentioned glucose being involved with cellular respiration. Not all the sugars that are taken in or sugars that are utilized by the coffee tree are in the form of glucose. Some of those are in the form of complex sugars like polysaccharides or other types of carbohydrates. And they have to be broken down into those base components to be able to be utilized in that process. I mentioned that here, and it'll start to make a lot more sense as we dive into our discussions on those different types of compounds and different impacts that fermentation has here over the subsequent days. So let me talk briefly, and I mentioned this already, and then we're going to move into a little bit different of a topic. But we've mentioned this idea of cellular respiration, and I already mentioned in that illustration where we saw that oxygen was present. Cellular respiration can be both aerobic or anaerobic. Okay, aerobic being that is with oxygen or utilizing oxygen, and that which is anaerobic or without oxygen. Okay, and I know that I hope in the back of our mind we can kind of put away for a second some of the discussion that we have in coffee that's related to this anaerobic process or all these other kind of terminology that's used, because I do want to be clear that there are some differences that we will see in how I'm describing and utilizing those terms here, and then how we might correlate those to coffee. Okay, so cellular respiration can be both aerobic and anaerobic. Aerobic being air or with oxygen, anaerobic without oxygen. Okay, now if there is oxygen present, and speaking just from a very strict oxygen present in the cellular respiration activity, it is very efficient and it produces a lot of energy. It's breathing. Okay, when there is anaerobic cellular respiration, that is where we can begin to step into this process of fermentation. Okay, now the question is all anaerobic cellular respiration fermentation? No, it's not. Because you have some living organisms that will use sulfates instead of oxygen, or that they will use other types of, whether it's salts, and I'll mention here more about some of those different types of microorganisms here in a minute, but essentially they're utilizing different types of compounds, and they're not necessarily producing energy or rather producing oxygen as a byproduct. Okay, so it is not accurate to say that all anaerobic cellular respiration is fermentation, and all fermentation it's not accurate to describe it as such. And that's why that synonym that we saw there for anaerobic respiration back up in the kind of botany textbook, it's why that's a little bit incomplete. They're discussing it from the sense of the environment, and that's what happens often. What oftentimes we find will happen in specifically coffee is some people will use the term anaerobic or aerobic to describe the environment, and other people are using that in a very strict textbook way of saying what is present as an electron receptor inside of that chemical, that metabolic pathway. So there's a little bit difference how that is utilized, and I'll articulate that more here when we kind of dive into a better definition of that. All right, I'm going to take a brief kind of trail, a brief rabbit trail, if you don't mind. I know that's a very English expression, but and I don't know if anybody's a Harry Potter fan or anything like that out there, but Sorting Hat, anybody? All right, cool. So I have small children, so that's on me. But all life is classified into a certain type of taxonomical structure. And I want to just briefly talk about that and give you some definitions here, so that when we use these terms later, it's clear, especially as we begin talking about different types of microorganisms. So Taxonomy structure. Carl Linnaeus is considered the father of modern taxonomy. If you've ever kind of taken one of our Q processing courses, we always talk about Cafe Arabica and how it was named and where it came from, etc. If you're interested, I always had a different mnemonic device. Mnemonic device being a kind of a tool you can use to memorize something. Do kings play cards on fat green stools? If that's helpful for you. But essentially, domain, kingdoms, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. And so essentially, it's a way that we are categorizing all of life into those different, and to be able to help identify it. Typically, you'll find that there is, say, for example, with the species, like you have Coffea arabica, you have the species name with an epithet that describes some type of describing word. And I'll talk more about that here in a second. But if we look at the three domains, there are three main domains of when we look at the classification of life. We have bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. Those are the three main domains. Bacteria would be categorized as a prokaryote, which means that they have no membrane or no nucleus. Okay, and it's not entirely important that we understand all the complexities of that, but that we understand those as characteristics. Hopefully also, knowing that you're not going to be like responsible for recalling this on an exam later, you're able to just kind of like sit back and like take the information in and just kind of think about it. I know that it's a lot of information, and taking notes and things like that is tough, but hopefully that's a reassuring aspect for you. Archaea are prokaryotes as well, but they have DNA and structure differences to bacteria. And one of the things about archaea that are specifically unique are that they typically live in extreme environments. So they're oftentimes called extremophiles. You have your halophiles here, which is a picture which they live in extreme salt conditions, or your methanogens, which methanogens are living inside high methane environments, and they actually live inside certain animals like cows, as a part of breaking down the compounds that they consume. Or you have thermophiles, which is another type of archaea, which is all about living. They like extreme temperatures, so whether it's very hot or very cold temperatures. And then we have eukarya. Eukarya are eukaryotes, which basically means that they have a nucleus enclosed within a nuclear membrane. Okay, and that's a really important distinction between used to be domains, and these have kind of developed over time and as science has advanced. You used to have a very strict prokaryotes and eukaryotes domain. Archaea was added, even though both bacteria and archaea are prokaryotes, because there's some differences. There's enough significant differences between them, but eukaryotes and eukarya are the main kind of distinction to your prokaryotes. And essentially, it has a nucleus enclosed within a nuclear membrane, and there is and the cells divide by mitosis, which is the process at which they divide and they grow and expand. And we'll talk more about eukaryotes and prokaryotes here in later as we dive into talking about microorganisms. Then we get to kingdom level, so domain, kingdom. I'm not going to walk through all 7 of the different levels, just a few of them. Interestingly, there's some discrepancy over how many different kingdoms there are, whether we should be talking about 7 or 6, but people typically agree that there's at least 6. It's some of the differences have to do, essentially, kingdoms are defined by how they obtain their food, the types of cells that make up their body, the number of cells they contain, etc. And this is where we find animal kingdom, plant kingdom, fungi, protist bacteria, and archaic bacteria or ancient bacteria. So kind of have these different divisions of kingdom. And like I said, you have this kind of entire progress from very broad, very wide at the base, and then going very, very specific. In addition to that, you also will find that in coffee, we start talking about varieties and cultivars and all that kind of stuff. And that's even getting more specific than your species level. If we kind of think about this in terms of where coffee sits, so coffee is a eukaryote. It is of the kingdom, plants. And as you progress down, the family is the Rubiaceae family, and genus we understand as Coffea linnaeus. Okay, Coffea L is how you often see it written, as Linnaeus is the one that's attributed with categorizing it. And then you get into your different species, roughly about 130 different species, known species, identified species that we have today. And we're kind of seeing that every few years that number expands as we learn more. It kind of used to be in the around 100, and then it made a jump up to like 120 and then 124, and continuing to see that grow as more research is being done into identifying some of these some coffee species throughout different parts of the world. And Coffea arabica, Coffea canephora being the two main species of coffee that are commercially grown around the world. And interestingly, you're seeing, and not that this is completely related to fermentation, but you're kind of seeing this where there used to be a much wider gap between the amount of arabica versus the amount of canephora in the world that is grown. You're seeing that starting to come closer and closer together to where it's now kind of in that 60-40 kind of range. And I think you'll continue to see that more and more. But that's not necessarily fermentation, just kind of global trends and other types of directions. So another note, again, I'm not necessarily at all the word police here. You'll see terminology like variety, cultivar, hybrids, etc., kind of utilized in coffee. And something to just just articulate is that the term cultivar is essentially a cultivated variety. Okay, that's what it's basically defined as, a cultivated variety. And it's really any type of variety that has been produced or cultivated through human interaction. Now, there is some element that a cultivar is also stable in terms of its genetic makeup. So if you take a cultivar and you plant it again, the genetics of it are quite stable. But our understanding is that there is some degree of human intervention. And I think a strong argument could be made that would we not be speaking about most plants, most varieties of coffee in the world as cultivars. And I want to mention that because for some reason in our industry, cultivar gets kind of like this bad rap, the name, like it's somehow inferior. But anyways, again, beyond the scope of fermentation, but I think important nonetheless. So to kind of take all of that information, we took a little bit of a rabbit trail with taxonomy. And the reason why is because we're going to be using some of those terminology of eukaryotes and prokaryotes and other things as we talk about microorganisms. And I just wanted to give you a little bit of context for what we were talking about. And plus, I always take an opportunity to mention some of the differences with cultivars, because I think it's an interesting stigma we have in our industry. But anyways. So all of this taken into consideration, how can we define fermentation, and what specifically is fermentation? And I do want to be clear that and many of you mentioned that the hydrolyzing or the loosening of the mucilage is a really important aspect to fermentation. But we need to make sure that we understand in a very strict sense that fermentation is the catabolic metabolic pathway of anaerobic cellular respiration that begins with glycolysis. Okay, now we're going to talk more about glycolysis in a later lesson, so just kind of put a pin in that for a second. But the very strict sense, fermentation is that catabolic metabolic pathway. So again, meaning that breaking down of compounds that's releasing energy. And we're understanding that microbes or microorganisms are the main actors in that process. So this microbial breakdown of compounds that's releasing energy. And I know that we kind of have thrown around these terms of anaerobic and aerobic, but the anaerobic cellular respiration aspect is that it does not require oxygen. The actual catabolic metabolic pathway of fermentation does not require oxygen. Now, again, I do want to note that depending on the levels of oxygen, you're going to have different types of microorganisms. We're going to talk about that more tomorrow. But it's and it's the cellular respiration part is this idea again, it's this catabolic metabolic pathway, but it's all about sustaining life. It's all about keeping the cellulars, the organisms alive and healthy. And kind of if we take a little bit of a step back to kind of bring in a little bit of a wider sense, it's that catabolic metabolic pathway that's can occur both in aerobic and anaerobic conditions that result in compounds that may impact the flavor and quality of a food product. Now, why do we give this strict and wider sense? Mainly because if we do need to, it is important rather to highlight that sense of fermentation, that catabolic metabolic pathway is going to produce byproducts that is going to impact the final characteristics of a food product. Okay, and that's really why we kind of want to expand that to a little bit of a wider sense, because we do need to understand that though there is a very strict sense of the chemical process and the chemical breakdown that is occurring, there are byproducts to that are essential that contribute to the quality of a food product. And the other note I want to add here, and I think this is where people like the Brando definition and even Ucker's, where that we just need to be careful in how we understand or how we translate or apply this aspect of fermentation, because these metabolic pathways, both catabolic and anabolic, are happening externally. So thinking specifically about coffee, they're happening externally in that mucilage or in that environment, but they're also happening inside of the coffee seed. And I'll just mention that one of the very fundamental metabolic pathways that occurs in coffee is as soon as that fruit is pulped, as soon as that skin is removed, you begin the process of germination. Now, that doesn't mean that, all of a sudden, boom, the embryo bursts forth and starts growing into a new plant. But actually, you have this release of enzymes that will encourage or begin to take your complex sugars, your sucrose, your fructose, or I'm sorry, your sucrose, and begin breaking those down into simple sugars that can be utilized in those different metabolic pathways. Okay. So when we think about fermentation, we need to remember that there are both processes happening externally outside of the seed and also internally inside of the seed. And somebody mentioned, Brian, I believe it was you, mentioned kind of that questioning. And yes, we are going to talk more about that. And I mentioned about that germination, but there are certain activities that are occurring. And oftentimes we focus a lot, and I think rightly so, on those processes as it relates to what's happening externally. And while that is important, we have thankfully moved away in our industry from this understanding that sugar somehow gets inside the coffee seed, and therefore that's why some coffees are sweeter. We've moved away from that because we understand that that's physically, literally, law of physics, kind of it doesn't happen. But yet we are understanding that there are certain compounds that are making their way into the seed that are influencing the final quality. And when we get to our later discussions about how fermentation impacts quality, we'll discuss some about that. And then finally, as we kind of wrap up this discussion about what is fermentation, we do want to make sure that while we understand the broader sense of what fermentation is, there are characters, microorganisms, that are essential to that process. And what we will define is we will define and we will understand fermentation as being done by any microorganism. So something that is external or that has different DNA to the coffee seed than the food product, in particularly your bacteria, your yeast, and your fungi. Okay, so not only are we talking about fermentation as being this metabolic pathway that can occur both in an aerobic or anaerobic environment that results in compounds that may impact the flavor and quality of a product, that are we're understanding as the main actors being microorganisms, specifically bacteria, yeast, and fungi. And our next discussion, when we pick up tomorrow, is going to be talking specifically about those microorganisms and about those different actors that are going to be responsible. And we'll begin to build some understanding for who those actors are, what they are actually, how they process and what they do, and we'll talk more specifics about that tomorrow. So I want to open the floor up if there's any questions specifically about kind of this foundational understanding. Our first time together, I always hesitate to tell people we're going to wrap early because then I start talking and it goes like way longer than what I anticipate. And so I didn't want to set that expectation. But I'm curious to know if there's any questions or any thoughts that you have on kind of how we approach what is fermentation, or even things that you're thinking about, questions that you have, if you want to throw in the chat or Adam. Again, I know that there will be some things that I'm going to hold off on discussing too much about until we kind of get to that point in our discussion, so that I make sure that we kind of fully dive into it. But yeah, I'll open the floor if you have any questions or any comments.
Hi, Tim. Thanks for this course. And this is Elif, by the way. I want to ask you something about this Brando's definition. Like at the end, you mentioned something like, okay, the fermentation. We focus on the outside mostly, and there are some activities on the outside of the bean, and also you said it impacts inside of the bean because the bean itself starts germinating and starts to produce some kind of enzymes. Did I understand it correctly? I just wanted to check
No,
that.
it's good. It's good. I did kind of throw a couple things out there. I probably was getting a little bit ahead of myself. But yes, it's important to articulate that when oftentimes when we're talking about fermentation in coffee, we we very often use that term to describe a step in the processing of coffee. So for example, oftentimes we're talking about fermentation as that step after pulping that is done in a concrete tank, in a bucket, a barrel, stainless steel tank, whatever it is. And we oftentimes use that term fermentation to describe that step or that stage in the processing. Whereas actually, fermentation is that metabolic pathway that microorganisms and other organisms utilize to sustain life. Okay, so that's kind of, while it's a little bit of a, I know it's kind of, are we just talking about semantics here? Not really. We're talking about this difference in use. So where I kind of come to at the end there is that fermentation is both activities that are occurring and taking place by microorganisms outside of the coffee seed, in that mucilage, in those tanks. There are microorganisms that are utilizing fermentation to break down food, break down to consume food that produces energy, and they're producing byproducts in that process. And these byproducts vary, they vary widely. But that aspect of fermentation being cellular respiration that occurs that without oxygen also occurs inside of the seed as the seed grows and continues to develop. And what I was mentioning with that kind of aspect of germination is that when we break the outer skin, and I'll talk more about this in subsequent lessons, but when we break that outer skin, we are signaling to that coffee seed that it is time to leave the nest and go find a new home. It's going to go off and go to college or take a gap year or whatever it's going to do. And it's going to, pursue its life goals of growing into a new coffee tree. Okay. That action of pulping that skin does begin a process of germination. And one of the first steps of that germination is this releasing of enzymes that happen inside of that coffee seed that begin to break down your complex sugars and produce simple sugars that are then utilized as a food source for that embryo in its growth. So why I want to why I mention that is because we oftentimes will, and you'll hear certain terminologies that are used of anaerobic cellular respiration or fermentation or alcoholic fermentation or all these different terms. And oftentimes we're talking about different points or different locations, maybe within the seed, outside of the seed, byproducts that are produced, etc. And the point is just to kind of establish that foundation of what, strictly speaking, is fermentation that then we can build on in kind of future lessons. I don't know if is that, does that answer your question?
Yep, yep, I understand better now. Thank you.
Oh, fantastic. And I apologize if I kind of just like zipped through that really quick. Anna, I see your note. What about viability of embryo during carbonic maceration? Yep, I'll write that one down and I'll try to address that in a later class. I don't know that I have a full answer for you, but we can definitely talk about it. And Anna's point here, her question, we oftentimes, we're a lot of the research right now as it pertains to drying, fermentation, other things, are looking at how the viability of the embryo inside of that seed contributes either in a positive or negative way to the quality and also the length of that quality, meaning the shelf life or the storing capacity of that coffee. So that's something that we'll consider and talk about briefly.
I've
Any
got a
any other
question.
questions? Yeah, go ahead.
You said at the end when you were defining fermentation again, you said strictly it is anaerobic, but in a wider sense, is both anaerobic and aerobic catabolic metabolic pathway. So which one should we consider, the both aerobic and anaerobic, or just anaerobic?
Yeah, great question. And really, I think the confusion comes in when we think about the way that the term is currently being used in a lot of the coffee industry, and then what the actual biological and kind of microbiological terminology is used. So just to kind of clarify that again, we understand that the actual catabolic metabolic pathway of anaerobic cellular respiration is what fermentation, and it begins with glycolysis. And again, I said I was going to talk more about that in a future lesson, but fermentation is that, and what we mean here by anaerobic cellular respiration is that and I'll go back here. Let me go back up here and show you. Here we can see that this action of cellular respiration that's using glucose and oxygen, this is aerobic cellular respiration. Okay, so it is cellular respiration that is using oxygen as one component in order to create energy. So it's going to be breaking down, it's going to be creating energy. There is a certain type of cellular respiration that is anaerobic, meaning that it does not use oxygen. Okay, so it utilizes other products. And fermentation is one of the ways that we would define, or when um, oxygen is not present, that anaerobic cellular respiration we can define or we can call fermentation. Now, not all anaerobic cellular respiration is necessarily fermentation, because not all includes glycolysis. And that's the key kind of distinction. Where we kind of broaden that out and use it in a wider sense is to articulate that in both environments that have oxygen and environments that have no oxygen, we understand that this pathway, this catabolic and metabolic pathway, can occur. That fermentation can occur. So, in this kind of wider sense, why we step out a little bit and kind of widen it is because we want to articulate that different amounts of oxygen that's present, whether it's aerobic or anaerobic, influences those types of microorganisms that are present, and therefore the type of byproducts that they produce during fermentation. Is that clear? Does that help some?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no problem. So the difference is just that in that strict sense, anaerobic cellular respiration is because fermentation does not involve the use of oxygen. okay, in a very strict sense. But in a wider sense, we understand that that process can occur in instances where we have aerobic and both anaerobic environments. And I know you're getting some people that will speak of like use different terms like anoxic or oxygen rich or oxygen starved or those types of terminologies. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with any of that. It's just in a strict sense, anaerobic is without oxygen, aerobic is with oxygen, and there's definite variations. Again, it's difficult when we come from a place of experience. We were talking about terms earlier. When we come from a place of experience where we've heard these terms used in different ways, it definitely influences how we understand these. And so that trying to get back to kind of the very distinct and strict definitions, and then we can look at applying that into different systems or different environments or different instances. Any other questions? Thank you very much, those of you, for throwing some questions out there. Great stuff. Awesome. So as I said, the tomorrow we're going to jump into microorganisms. We're going to talk about some of the different types of actors and players that we have in coffee processing. I would really encourage you, and even within the center, within that course overview, if you go in and you log in and you go to the actual fermentation course, there's a discuss tab up at the top, kind of left side. I always forget it's opposite. I don't know. Is this left? Is this right? I always forget. If I'm look, anyways, top left. If you go, there's a discuss tab, and you can click on that, and you can feel free to send any questions across or thoughts or comments. I track that and follow that, and even some of the follow up. Some of the sources and some of those names might even throw into there as well, just so there's a record of that, or just a record for you to refer back to if you ever want to. And then I will email everybody this afternoon. Yes, it is also really good for discussions. Thank you, Anna. I will send you an email later on my afternoon, so in the next several hours, with the next session link. And I'll kind of just do that every day. I do a fresh session link. Some of it's for security, but then also just so that I can make sure I'm getting you that information. And I look forward to our discussion tomorrow. I'll hang around here for a few moments if anybody has any specific questions or anything to discuss. But if not, I will see you same time tomorrow. So thank you so much for joining in, and until tomorrow.
See you. Have a good day.
All right, you too.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.
Thank you.
Team.